March 23, 1945, the Rhine River. Near Wesel the air was damp and cold, the kind that carried every sound across the water. Faint engine murmurs echoed through the fog on the western bank. American engineers tightened straps, checked fuel, and waited for the signal. Their silhouettes moved like shadows among the reeds, silent. Practiced, steady on the opposite shore, in the ruins of a shattered village. A group of German soldiers leaned over sandbags. Peering into the mist, they had heard the rumors. The Americans were bringing floating trucks. They laughed it was absurd. Trucks couldn't swim. One of them joked that perhaps the Yankees had finally gone mad. Another shrugged. Certain the river would stop them where the Wehrmacht still stood, but then. The hum grew louder, engines multiplied. From the darkness, gray shapes emerged, first rippling, then gliding, trucks rolling off the water like ghosts. The laughter stopped. The impossible had arrived, and by dawn, the Rhine, once Germany's final shield, would be crawling with ducks. By early 1945, Germany was dying, not suddenly, but in slow, painful convulsions. The Reich that once stretched across Europe was now cornered, bleeding from every direction in the west. The Allies had broken through France, crossed Belgium, and were pressing against Germany's very heartland to the east. The Red Army was advancing through Poland and tearing into Prussia. Every German city shook beneath the thunder of bombs. Yet, there was one barrier that gave the Wehrmacht a fleeting sense of hope: the Rhine River. For centuries, the Rhine had been more than a geographical feature. It was a symbol of German pride and defense, the ancient line that marked the boundary between the homeland and the invader. When the Romans came, they stopped at the Rhine. When Napoleon rose, he marched along it, and now, in the final months of the Second World War, it stood once again as the last great natural wall between the Allies and the German interior. Adolf Hitler himself declared that no enemy would ever cross the Rhine. He ordered his remaining divisions to defend it to the last man. In his delusional confidence, he believed that the river's width, current, and destroyed bridges would stall the Allied advance long enough for a miracle, perhaps the development of new weapons, or a fractured alliance among his enemies. But the generals on the ground knew better. The Western Front was collapsing after the failure of the Ardennes offensive, the so-called Battle of the Bulge. Germany had exhausted its final reserves of armor, fuel, and men. Many divisions now consisted of barely trained recruits, old men from the Volkssturm, or remnants of shattered units hastily reorganized. Meanwhile, the Americans and British were moving with terrifying precision. By March 1945, Field Marshal Montgomery's 21st Army Group had reached the northern sector of the Rhine, while General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group advanced in the center, and General George S. Patton's Third Army thundered in the south. The Allies had already seized Cologne and reached the river at several points. Then, something extraordinary happened on March 7, 1945. An American unit from the 9th Armored Division captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, intact. It was a miracle of timing and courage. The Germans had tried to blow it up, but the charges failed within hours. Thousands of U.S. troops had crossed the Rhine. The news electrified Allied command and terrified Berlin, but that crossing, though bold, was only the beginning. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, knew he needed to move not just soldiers, but entire armies, tanks, artillery, supplies, across the river in days, not weeks. Bridges could be destroyed again. Pontoon systems were slow and vulnerable. The Americans needed a way to bring war machines and logistics across water without waiting for engineers to build traditional crossings. That was where ingenuity met necessity in the form of a strange, amphibious vehicle that looked like a truck, floated like a boat, and would soon make history: the DUKW. Known to soldiers as the Duck, few in Germany had ever seen one, even among Allied troops. The DUKW had been an oddity, first used in Sicily, then in Normandy. where it ferried men and supplies over beaches under fire. But here, at the Rhine, it was about to prove itself indispensable. In March 1945, Operation Plunder was launched, the massive Allied plan to cross the Rhine near Wesel. It was Montgomery's masterpiece, a coordinated assault involving air, land, and water forces, supported by paratroopers from Operation Varsity, the largest airborne operation ever conducted on a single day, while British and Canadian forces prepared to attack from the north. The U.S. Ninth Army assembled along the western bank. The Rhine at Wesel was nearly 400 yards wide, with strong currents and flooded banks. The Germans had blown the bridges and dug in artillery. Along the far side, they believed the river was impregnable, an open moat of death, and that was when the ducks began to line up. American engineers rolled the DUKWs to the riverbanks, their six-wheel hulls glistening with water and mud. Each one carried troops, ammunition, or supplies, and each could drive straight into the Rhine without stopping. They didn't need bridges, they didn't need ferries. They simply swam as night fell on March 23rd. Engines whispered beneath the fog, and the greatest river crossing in Western Europe began. The night of March 23, 1945, was heavy with mist and anticipation along the western banks of the Rhine near Wesel. The British Second Army and the U.S. Ninth Army waited in silence. Hundreds of amphibious vehicles, assault boats, pontoon ferries, and artillery pieces stood ready, their silhouettes barely visible in the moonlight. What was about to unfold would be one of the most complex and synchronized operations in the entire European campaign. Operation Plunder. At precisely 9 p.m., Allied artillery erupted with an intensity not seen since D-Day. More than 3,500 guns opened fire. Shaking the earth, the bombardment lit up the horizon like 1,000 lightning strikes. German defenses on the eastern bank, bunkers, trenches, machine gun nests were obliterated within minutes. Smoke and debris turned the night into chaos for the soldiers waiting in the mud. It was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Then came the movement. The first wave of British commandos and American infantry began boarding their amphibious craft. Among the landing vehicles were hundreds of DUKWs, six-wheeled, 31-foot amphibious trucks designed to carry up to 25 tons of cargo over both land and water. Originally developed in 1942 by a partnership between General Motors and the U.S. Army, the DUKW had already proven its worth in earlier amphibious assaults, from Sicily to Normandy to the crossing of the Seine. But here, on the Rhine, it was about to become indispensable. The DUKW's unique advantage lay in its versatility. It could drive across land like any other truck, roll straight into the water, and keep moving without pause. Its hull was watertight and shaped like a boat, and its propeller and rudder system allowed it to maneuver efficiently in river currents. It could carry everything: soldiers, ammunition, jeeps, even small artillery. In short, it eliminated one of the most time-consuming elements of river warfare, the need to transfer cargo between vehicles and boats. As the bombardment continued, DUKWs roared to life, their tires splashed into the riverbank, and one after another, they entered the Rhine. The sight was surreal, hundreds of trucks floating across the moonlit water, engines humming under fire. The Germans on the far side could scarcely believe what they were seeing. To them, the Americans appeared to be driving straight across the river on the northern sector. Montgomery's 21st Army Group coordinated an astonishing logistical ballet. British, Canadian, and American units moved with mechanical precision. Engineers, sappers, and naval personnel guided waves of amphibious vehicles to pre-designated crossing points. Spotlights and searchlights, reflected off low clouds, created an eerie artificial dawn in support of the river assault. Operation Varsity was launched at first light on March 24th. Over 16,000 paratroopers from the U.S. 17th Airborne and the British 6th Airborne Divisions dropped behind enemy lines, securing key bridges and roads east of the Rhine. It was the largest airborne operation conducted in a single day, and it stunned the Germans completely. The DUKWS, meanwhile, became the lifeline of the assault. They ferried waves of infantry across under constant sniper and artillery fire, then returned loaded with wounded men within the first 24 hours. Thousands of troops had reached the eastern shore. Armored vehicles followed, carried by Bailey bridges that engineers built under fire to the German defenders. The entire operation seemed impossible. Their commanders had been told that the Allies would need weeks to construct proper bridging and ferries. Instead, the Americans and British were across the river in less than a day. Rhine, the sacred boundary of the Reich, had been breached. Reports from German positions near Wesel and Rhine describe panic and disbelief. Many soldiers abandoned their posts, others surrendered as Allied firepower rained down relentlessly. A captured German officer reportedly muttered, "They are everywhere, even the river cannot stop them." Behind this stunning success lay not only courage and coordination, but also industrial ingenuity. The DUKW represented the kind of technological flexibility that defined American warfare in the late stages of World War II, a fusion of mass production, mechanical innovation, and field adaptability. Over 21,000 units had been built by 1945, and by this stage of the war, they were being deployed across Europe and the Pacific. But their true test came here, on this river that symbolized the heart of Germany. By the evening of March 24th, Montgomery reported to Eisenhower that the Rhine had been crossed in force. British and American flags now flew on the eastern bank. Bridges were being completed to allow tanks and heavy vehicles to roll through. The impenetrable river barrier had lasted barely 36 hours, yet for the men on the front lines, the moment was more than strategic, it was deeply symbolic. The Rhine had been Hitler's final boast, his last illusion of security. Watching the DUKWS glide across its surface like a fleet of metallic waterfowl felt like a visual metaphor for the end of the Reich on that night. Amid the roar of engines and the flash of artillery, Germany's last natural defense line was erased, not by superweapons or sheer numbers, but by ingenuity, coordination, and the will to adapt. The Ducks had arrived, and with them, the end of the Third Reich was now only weeks away. When the DUKWs rolled toward the Rhine in March 1945, they represented more than just machines. They embodied a philosophy of warfare that prized flexibility, speed, and adaptation over static defense. To understand how these amphibious ducks changed the course of river warfare, one must look beyond their shape and steel, into the multiple layers that made them a symbol of American ingenuity. In the final act of World War II, the infantrymen who rode them, the DUKWs, were both a blessing and a gamble. Crossing a river under artillery fire was among the most dreaded tasks in warfare. The soldiers knew that water offered no cover. In the words of Sergeant John Kelly of the U.S. 79th Infantry Division, "You couldn't dig a foxhole in the Rhine. You just had to trust the boat beneath your boots." That boat was in fact a six-wheeled truck sealed tight against the elements. The men sat shoulder to shoulder, weapons clutched, watching tracer rounds ricochet across the water. The hum of the Duka's engine was steady, unyielding, a mechanical heartbeat in a storm of chaos. Many soldiers described an odd calm once they were in motion, a feeling that the rhythmic churn of the propeller somehow steadied their nerves. When the DUKW's front tires touched the opposite bank, that relief was indescribable. They had done what no one thought possible, crossed the Rhine under fire for the drivers, often from the U.S. Army's transportation corps. The task required skill and courage. They navigated smoke-shrouded waters, avoiding wreckage and underwater obstacles while artillery thundered above. Theirs was a job that blended the precision of an engineer with the nerves of a combat pilot. Each successful crossing meant more than logistics. It meant hope that the war was entering its final chapter from a military perspective. The DUKW solved a tactical dilemma that had haunted commanders for generations: how to sustain forward momentum after breaching a river line. Normally, river crossings demanded long delays, pontoon construction, ferry assembly, and the risky transfer of cargo between land and water vehicles. DUKW eliminated those pauses entirely. It drove from depot to front line to river and beyond, maintaining a continuous logistical chain. Supplies that once took hours to reach advancing troops now arrived within minutes. Ammunition, rations, and reinforcements flowed across the Rhine as seamlessly as if the river did not exist. This efficiency created tactical shock. German defenses, already thin and fragmented by the Allied bombing campaign, could not react quickly enough. They had expected time, days or even weeks, before the Allies could bring their armor across. Instead, within hours, hundreds of DUKWs had established a bridgehead deep behind their lines. The vehicle's ability to adapt to terrain made it invaluable in unpredictable environments. Muddy banks, shallow tributaries, and debris-strewn roads were no obstacle. The DUKW could be inflated or deflated to adjust tire pressure on the move, a feature decades ahead of its time. Field reports from the Ninth Army noted that supply lines using DUKWs experienced almost no disruption. Even under heavy fire, they were small targets, mobile, and easily dispersed. The result was a fluid form of warfare that left the enemy disoriented, a stark contrast to the slow, methodical tempo of traditional river crossings. In essence, the DUKW transformed logistics into a weapon. The DUKW's design was deceptively simple, based on the chassis of the GMCC KW2.5-ton truck, the workhorse of the U.S. Army. It was modified with a boat-shaped hull, bilge pumps, and a propeller, but what made it revolutionary was its hybrid capability. It wasn't just a truck that could float. It was a complete amphibious system that needed no external assistance to transition between land and water. Engineers at General Motors and naval architects at Sparkman and Stevens, the same firm that designed America's racing yachts, collaborated on its development. In 1942, the vehicle could reach 50 miles per hour on land and about 6 miles per hour on water. Its front-mounted propeller and rear rudder were controlled by a simple lever beside the driver's seat, while its 6-wheel drive system gave it traction across mud, sand, and steep banks. The most advanced feature, however, was its ability to adjust tire pressure using an onboard air compressor. The driver could deflate the tires for soft terrain, then reinflate them for road driving, a feature so effective that it was later adopted in modern off-road and military vehicles. Despite its ungainly look, the DUKW was a marvel of reliability. It could carry troops, supplies, even jeeps and anti-aircraft guns in Italy and the Pacific. It ferried men across flooded valleys and coral lagoons at Normandy. It brought ammunition ashore when rough seas prevented landing craft from approaching. By the time of the Rhine crossings, the DUKW had evolved from a logistical tool into a strategic asset. Its success demonstrated that mobility was now as decisive as firepower. Each of these angles, human courage, tactical innovation, and technological brilliance, converged on that misty night at the Rhine. The Germans had believed their river would stop the Americans cold. Instead, they watched in disbelief as mechanical ducks carried an entire army across their nation's final line of defense. The true turning point, however, was still ahead. The breach of the Rhine opened the gateway into the German heartland and set the stage for the Allies' unstoppable push toward Berlin. As the Allied invasion of Normandy unfolded, every vantage point, every hilltop, every stretch of sky became part of a vast contest of angles, mathematical, tactical, And human, the success or failure of D-Day was not only decided by the weight of numbers or the thunder of artillery, but by geometry, the precision of approach, the line of sight, the slope of a cliff, and the arc of descent from the skies above France. Every soldier, sailor, and pilot on June 6, 1944, fought not just against an enemy, but against the tyranny of terrain and distance. From the moment the first gliders took off in the early hours of the morning, angles began to define fate. The British and American airborne divisions, dropped behind enemy lines, depended on perfect trajectories through moonlit skies. Yet, even the slightest miscalculation, a gust of wind, a burst of flak, a premature release, could scatter entire battalions across miles of hedgerows and fields. Paratroopers trained endlessly for precise landings. But as their boots struck the dark, dew-soaked earth of Normandy, many found themselves far from their intended drop zones. The geometry of war had turned chaotic. The perfect line became a broken curve in the air. Pilots navigated through narrow corridors of flak and cloud, adjusting attack angles by seconds and degrees. Shallow dive could spare them from anti-aircraft fire, but risked missing their targets. Too steep, and they might never pull up in time for the men flying over Omaha Beach. The challenge was brutal. Visibility was poor. The coastline was shrouded in smoke, and enemy defenses were almost invisible until it was too late. Bombs fell at imperfect angles, shells ricocheted off hardened bunkers, and landing craft steered through waves that twisted their approach paths. Even nature conspired in geometry on the beaches. The angles became a matter of survival. The German fortifications of the Atlantic Wall were built with cold, mathematical precision. Walls slanted to deflect shells, embrasures cut to allow interlocking fields of fire, and obstacles set to trap incoming craft at high tide. Every firing position, every pillbox window, was engineered to exploit angles, to turn the narrowest gap into a lethal corridor from their elevated positions. German gunners could sweep the beach in deadly crossfire, ensuring that every inch of sand was covered by overlapping arcs of machine gun fire for the Allies below. The problem was one of impossible geometry: how to attack a slope under fire. Where every upward step increased exposure, soldiers who made it off their landing craft found themselves pinned to the sand. Calculating survival in inches, the contour of a dune, the shadow of a hedgehog obstacle, the slope of a cratered path, some learned that even the smallest change in angle could mean the difference between life and death. Lying flat reduced a target's visibility. By half-crawling toward a seawall at an oblique angle might avoid a machine gun's fixed line. The human mind became an instinctive computer, solving problems of trajectory under fire in the naval operations offshore. Geometry again ruled the moment destroyers moved in dangerously close to provide direct fire support, adjusting their guns for plunging fire that could reach bunkers buried deep within cliffs. The success of each salvo depended on precise trigonometric calculations: distance, elevation, wind speed, even the swell of the sea. A single misjudgment could send the shell into friendly lines or fall harmlessly into the surf. Yet, despite the chaos, many of these ships performed miracles of accuracy, hitting fortifications with pinpoint timing by midday. As the tide turned and the beaches began to fill with reinforcements, the Allies began to exploit the geometry in their favor. Engineers cleared obstacles, creating new angles of advance through minefields and wire tanks, especially the amphibious DD, duplex drive. Shermans used the shallow gradients of the beaches to climb into firing positions. Snipers and artillery spotters found elevated ground, turning the high angles once dominated by the Germans into platforms of vengeance. Slowly, the balance of geometry, and thus of power, shifted inland. The hedgerows presented a new challenge of angles, each thick. Earthen wall created blind corners and kill zones. Infantry squads had to adapt, learning to clear intersections by firing diagonally through gaps and cutting through the earth itself to gain Alternate lines of sight, the Normandy countryside, once serene and pastoral, became a brutal maze of intersecting angles where visibility and surprise meant everything, even in the minds of commanders. The concept of angles dictated strategy. The invasion was not one linear push, but a series of converging attacks from the sea, from the air, from the paratroopers inland. The Allies sought to create a triangle of pressure that would collapse German defenses from multiple directions. At once General Eisenhower's planners understood that the invasion's geometry had to be fluid. Every landing point, every airborne drop, every beachhead connected by invisible lines of reinforcement and supply by nightfall. As exhausted soldiers looked back toward the sea, the angles of war had shifted permanently. The once perfect symmetry of the German Atlantic Wall had been fractured. Its carefully measured fields of fire had been disrupted by chaos, smoke, and courage. The Allies had found new paths through impossible defenses, turning geometry itself against its architects on D-Day. The battlefield was a living equation, one solved not by compasses and protractors, but by instinct, bravery, and sacrifice. Every decision, to duck, to crawl, to charge, was a calculation, and by the day's end, it was clear that the Allies had mastered not only the angles of approach, but the very shape of victory. By the evening of June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy were no longer silent stretches of sand and sea. They were graveyards of ambition and courage, littered with the wreckage of war, twisted metal, charred landing craft, shattered helmets, and the still bodies of men who had crossed the channel and met eternity before setting foot in land. Smoke drifted lazily over the water as the tide came in, carrying with it fragments of uniforms, rations, and hope. The invasion that had begun as a desperate gamble was now a reality carved into the coast of France for the Allies. The cost was staggering. By nightfall, over 10,000 men had been killed, wounded, or declared missing. The beaches of Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, and Sword were secured, but barely at Omaha alone. The slaughter was biblical. Waves of soldiers cut down before they could even find cover. Platoons were erased in minutes. Officers who survived often found themselves leading fragments of companies, sometimes just a handful of men, and yet, despite the carnage, the beachheads held behind them. The channel seethed with life. Waves of reinforcements poured across. Engineers, medics, artillerymen, all working feverishly to expand the tenuous foothold, the Mulberry Harbors. Massive artificial ports designed in secret months earlier began to take shape offshore, allowing the Allies to unload tanks, fuel, and supplies directly onto the beaches. The sea that had once divided Europe now became the artery of liberation inland. However, the reality of Normandy was far different from the maps in Allied headquarters. The countryside, a patchwork of narrow lanes and dense hedgerows, turned every kilometer into a battle. German forces, though stunned, regrouped quickly. The 12th SS Panzer Division and elite Wehrmacht units counterattacked, turning the green fields into killing zones. Villages like Carentan, Cannes, and Saint-Lay became names whispered with dread. The Allies had broken through the beaches, but France itself was a maze of resistance for German commanders. The aftermath was chaos and disbelief. The Atlantic Wall, once hailed as impregnable, had crumbled in less than a day. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who had argued for a mobile defense inland, was away in Germany when the invasion began. His subordinates were left scrambling, constrained by Hitler's direct orders to hold every position to the last man. Panzer divisions sat idle for hours, awaiting permission to move, a fatal delay that handed the Allies time to consolidate. By the time reinforcements arrived, the initiative was gone. The Luftwaffe, once feared across Europe, was almost absent from the skies. Allied air supremacy was total. Any German convoy, any movement by daylight, risked annihilation. From above. Bridges, roads, and railways across northern France were obliterated. What remained of the German logistical network disintegrated under constant bombardment. The Reich's western defenses were bleeding from every artery. Civilians, too, bore the scars of the invasion. The villages of Normandy were caught in the crossfire, their stone walls collapsing under artillery. Their fields churned into mud and craters. Tens of thousands fled, clutching what few belongings they could carry, while others hid in cellars as the sky thundered to many. Liberation and destruction arrived hand in hand as days turned into weeks. The scale of Operation Overlord revealed itself within 10 days. Over 500,000 Allied troops had landed in France. Columns of tanks rolled through the bocage, aircraft roared overhead, and supply convoys stretched endlessly back to the beaches. Yet the human cost mounted. Every hedgerow, every farmhouse, every crossroads had to be fought for. The push toward Cannes, originally intended to fall on D-Day, took nearly 2 months and cost thousands of lives. And yet, amid the exhaustion, a sense of destiny took hold. The beaches had been secured not merely by strength, but by resilience, by men who refused to retreat when everything seemed lost. In the ruined villages and blood-soaked fields, medics worked beside chaplains, engineers beside riflemen, all bound by a single purpose: to open the road to Paris, and from there, to the heart of the Reich in Berlin. Hitler raged at his generals. The Atlantic fortress had fallen, his divisions were in retreat, and the Western Front was collapsing faster than his propaganda could explain. Yet he refused to accept the truth. The war in the West was lost on June 6th. When the first Allied soldiers waded ashore and refused to be driven back into the sea as the sun set over Normandy days later, Allied ships still dotted the horizon. Stretching farther than the eye could see, what had begun as a daring invasion had become an unstoppable tide behind the lines. Generals planned the next phase, Operation Cobra. The breakout toward Brittany and Paris ahead lay months of grinding combat. But the impossible had been achieved. The liberation of Western Europe had begun. Price of that day would echo through generations in the cemeteries that line the coast, where white crosses and stars of David stand in perfect rows above the cliffs. Each one marks a life that helped turn the tide of history. D-Day was not the end of the war, but it was the beginning of the end, and as veterans later recalled, the silence that followed the guns was almost unbearable for a few brief hours. The beaches that had screamed with death fell quiet, touched only by the wind and the sea, as if the land itself was exhaling after holding its breath for too long. War had entered a new chapter, one that would carry the Allies deep into France, across the Rhine, and ultimately into the ruins of Berlin. In the quiet that followed the storm, the beaches of Normandy stood as both a wound and a monument. The tide erased the footprints of thousands, but not the memory of what had been done there. D-Day was more than a battle. It was the moment when courage outweighed fear, when humanity, fractured by tyranny, began to heal through sacrifice. Every inch of sand bought that day carried the weight of generations. The men who landed there were ordinary in every way: farmhands, factory workers, teachers, sons, yet they achieved something extraordinary. They faced machine guns and artillery, not because they sought glory, but because they believed that freedom, once lost, was worth dying for. For Germany, Normandy marked the beginning of the end. The myth of invincibility, built through years of conquest, shattered beneath the Allied tide. And for the world, June 6, 1944, became a lesson in endurance, proof that even in the darkest chapters of history, the human spirit could rise, battered but unbroken. Decades later, the beaches are peaceful again. Tourists walk where soldiers once fell. The waves whisper against the shore, carrying echoes of commands, prayers, and final words. Long-faded white crosses gleam under the gray French sky, stretching in endless rows, not as symbols of war, but of the cost of peace. In the end, D-Day was not defined by victory alone, but by resolve. It was a moment when the free world united against despair, when thousands of men stepped into the unknown so that others might live free. Their legacy endures not in medals or monuments, but in the quiet freedoms we often take for granted: the right to speak, to dream, to live without fear. And as history continues its relentless march forward, Normandy remains a sacred reminder that liberty is never given, only earned, often at a price the living can scarcely comprehend. The tide still rises and falls over those same sands. Time moves on, but the courage that crossed the channel that morning, that will never fade.